History and Nature. Haile Selassie. Negus on August. Haile Selassie in the full ceremonial dress uniform of a field marshal, 1970. Emperor of Ethiopia. Reign April 2, 1930 to May 2, 1936. January 20, 1941. September 12, 1974. Coronation November 2, 1930. Predecessor Zudatu. Successor Haile Selassie. Prime Minister. List of Prime Ministers. Regent of Ethiopia. Reign September 27, 1916 to April 2, 1930. Predecessor Tessamanatu. Monarch Zudatu. Successor Kirabel Abraham. Born Li Tafari Makonnen. Tafari Makonnen. July 23, 1892. Egersagoro, Hararg, Ethiopian Empire. Died August 27, 1975, aged 83. Jubilee Palace, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Burial November 5, 2000. Holy Trinity Cathedral, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Spousman and Osfa. History and Nature. Issue. Princess Romain work. Princess Tenagna work. Crown Prince Osfa Wosan. Princess Zand work. Princess Sahai. Prince Makonnen. Prince Haile Selassie. House of Shua. Dynasty Solomonic Dynasty. Father Makonnen Wolde Mikhail. Mother Yashimbet Ali. Religion Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo. Signature Haile Selassie I's signature. First and fifth chairperson of the Organization of African Unity. In office. May 25, 1963 to July 17, 1964. Succeeded by Gamal Abdel Nasser. In office. November 5, 1966 to September 11, 1967. Preceded by Joseph Arthur Ankara. Succeeded by Mobutu Sese Seko. History and Nature. Military career. Allegiance Ethiopian Empire. Service/branch Army of the Ethiopian Empire. Imperial Ethiopian Navy. Ethiopian Imperial Air Force. Years of service 1930 to 1974. Rank Field Marshal. Commands held Commander-in-Chief. Battle/wars. History and Nature. Haile Selassie I's voice. Duration, 1 minute and 3 seconds. 1:03. Speech to the Ethiopian Parliament following the occasion of a new constitution. Recorded November 4, 1955. Haile Selassie I, Geez, Romanized, Kadama I Haile Selassie, born Tafari Makonnen, July 23, 1892 to August 27, 1975, was the Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974. He rose to power as Regent Plenipotentiary of Ethiopia, and Res, for Empress Zudatu from 1916 until 1930. Haile Selassie is widely considered a defining figure in modern Ethiopian history, and the major figure of Rastafari, a religious movement in Jamaica that emerged shortly after he became emperor in the 1930s. Before he rose to power he defeated Ras Gug Savella Biddle, nephew of Empress Tato, of Bagumdar at the Battle of Ankem in 1928. He was a member of the Solomonic dynasty, which claims to trace lineage to Emperor Menelik I, a legendary figure believed by the claimants to be the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, who they name as Makeda. History and Nature. Haile Selassie attempted to modernize the country through a series of political and social reforms, including the introduction of the 1931 Constitution, its first written constitution, and the abolition of slavery. He led the failed efforts to defend Ethiopia during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War and spent most of the period of Italian occupation exiled in the United Kingdom. In 1940, he traveled to the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan to assist in coordinating the anti-fascist struggle in Ethiopia and returned to his home country in 1941 after the East African Campaign. He dissolved the Federation of Ethiopia and Eritrea, which was established by the UN General Assembly in 1950, and annexed Eritrea into Ethiopia as one of its provinces, while fighting to prevent secession. History and nature. Haile Selassie's internationalist views led to Ethiopia becoming a charter member of the United Nations. In 1963, he presided over the formation of the Organization of African Unity, the precursor of the African Union, and served as its first chairman. In 1974, he was overthrown in a military coup by a Marxist, Leninist junta, the Derg. On August 27, 1975, Haile Selassie was assassinated by Derg military officers, a fact that was only revealed in 1994. Among some members of the Rastafari movement, Haile Selassie is referred to as the returned Messiah of the Bible, God incarnate. This distinction notwithstanding, he was a Christian and adhered to the tenets and liturgy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. He has been criticized by some historians for his suppression of rebellions among the landed aristocracy, the Messafint, which consistently opposed his changes. Some critics have also criticized Ethiopia's failure to modernize rapidly enough. During his rule the Harari people were persecuted and many left the Harari region. His administration was also criticized by human rights groups, such as Human Rights Watch, as autocratic and illiberal. Although some sources state that late during his administration the Oromo language was banned from education, public speaking, and use in administration, there was never an official law or government policy that criminalized any language. The Haile Selassie government relocated numerous Amharas into southern Ethiopia where they served in government administration, courts, and church. Following the death of Hashalu Hundessa in June 2020, the statue of Haile Selassie in Canizaro Park, London was destroyed by Oromo protesters, and his father's equestrian monument in Harar was removed. History and nature. Name. Haile Selassie was known as a child as Li Tafari Makonnen, Geez, Romanized, Lj Tafarimkan. Li is translated as child and serves to indicate that a youth is of noble blood. His given name Tafari means one who is respected or feared. Like most Ethiopians, his personal name Tafari is followed by that of his father Makonnen and that of his grandfather Wolde Mikhail. His name Haile Selassie was given to him at his infant baptism and adopted again as part of his regnal name in 1930. On November 1, 1905, at the age of 13, Tafari was appointed by his father as the Djazmach of Gara Malata, a region some 20 miles southwest of Harar. The literal translation of Djazmach is keeper of the door. It is a title of nobility equivalent to a count. On September 27, 1916, he was proclaimed crown prince and heir apparent to the throne, Alga Waruk, and appointed regent plenipotentiary, Bailmula Sultan and Reis. On February 11, 1917, he was crowned Lelras and became known as Ras Tafari Makonnen Lisan. Ras is translated as head and is a rank of nobility equivalent to a duke, though it is often rendered in translation as prince. Originally the title Lel, which means Your Highness, was only ever used as a form of address. However, in 1917 the title Lelras replaced the senior office of Ras Bitwadid and so became the equivalent of a royal duke. In 1928, Empress Zudita planned on granting him the throne of Shua. However, at the last moment opposition from certain provincial rulers caused a change and his title Negus or king was conferred without geographical qualification or definition. History and nature. This article contains Ethiopic text. Without proper rendering support, you may see question marks, boxes, or other symbols instead of Ethiopic characters. On November 2, 1930, after the death of Empress Zudita, Tafari was crowned Negus on August, literally King of Kings, rendered in English as Emperor. Upon his ascension, he took as his regnal name Haile Selassie I. Haile means in Geez power of and Selassie means Trinity, therefore Haile Selassie roughly translates to power of the Trinity. Haile Selassie's full title in office was by the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Elect of God. This title reflects Ethiopian dynastic traditions, which hold that all monarchs must trace their lineage to Menelik I, who is described by the Kebra Nagast, a 14th century CE national epic, as the son of the 10th century BCE King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. History and nature. Then Tafari Makonnen wearing a warrior's dress, before 1924. Then Tafari Makonnen wearing a warrior's dress. Ras Makonnen Woldemikael and his son Li Tafari Makonnen. Ras Makonnen Woldemikael and his son Li Tafari Makonnen. To Ethiopians, Haile Selassie has been known by many names, including Yanhoi, His Majesty, Telekumari, Great Leader, and Abatikal, Father of Tikal, his horse name. The Rastafari movement employs many of these appellations, also referring to him as Ya Rastafari, and him, the abbreviation of His Imperial Majesty. History and nature. Biography. Main article, Chronology of Haile Selassie. Early life. Tafari's royal line, through his paternal grandmother, descended from the Shawan Amhara's Solomonic king, Haile Selassie. He was born on July 23, 1892, in the village of Ajersagoro, in the Hararge province of Ethiopia. Tafari's mother, Waizero, Lady, Yashimbet Ali Abajifar, was paternally of Oromo descent and maternally of Gurage heritage, while his father, Ras Makonnen Woldemikael, was maternally of Amhara descent, but his paternal lineage remains disputed. Tafari's paternal grandfather belonged to a noble family from Shua and was the governor of the districts of Menz and Daba, which are located in Semi and Shua. Tafari's mother was the daughter of a ruling chief from Werilu in Wolo province, Djazmach Ali Abajifar. Ras Makonnen was the grandson of King Haile Selassie, who was once the ruler of Shua. He served as a general in the First Italo-Ethiopian War, playing a key role at the Battle of Adwa. Haile Selassie was thus able to ascend to the imperial throne through his paternal grandmother, Waizero Tenagnawork Haile Selassie, who was an aunt of Emperor Menelik II and daughter of the Solomonic Amhara king of Shua, Nega Haile Selassie. As such, Haile Selassie claimed direct descent from Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, and King Solomon of ancient Israel. Ras Makonnen arranged for Tafari as well as his first cousin, Imru Haile Selassie, to receive instruction in Harar from Abba Samuel Woldekahin, an Ethiopian Capuchin friar, and from Dr. Vidalin, a surgeon from Guadeloupe. Tafari was named Djazmach, literally commander of the gate, roughly equivalent to count, at the age of 13, on November 1, 1905. Shortly thereafter, his father Makonnen died at Kolabai, in 1906. History and nature. Governorship. Djazmach Tafari, as governor of Harar. Tafari assumed the titular governorship of Salil in 1906, a realm of marginal importance, but one that enabled him to continue his studies. In 1907, he was appointed governor over part of the province of Sidamo. It is alleged that during his late teens, Haile Selassie was married to Waizero Altayuk, and that from this union, his daughter Princess Romanework was born. Following the death of his brother Yelma in 1907, the governorate of Harar was left vacant, and its administration was left to Menelik's loyal general, Djazmach Balcha Safo. Balcha Safo's administration of Harar was ineffective, and so during the last illness of Menelik II, and the brief reign of Empress Tato Batul, Tafari was made governor of Harar in 1910 or 1911. History and nature. Marriage. Together with his wife, Empress Menon Asfa, 1955. On August 3, 1911, Tafari married Menon Asfa of Ambassal, niece of the heir to the throne Liyiyasu. Menon Asfa was 22 years old while Tafari was 19 years of age. Menon had already married two previous noblemen, while Tafari had one previous wife and one child. The marriage between Menon Asfa and Haile Selassie lasted for 50 years, which marked the golden anniversary of their marriage. Although possibly a political match designed to create peace between Ethiopian nobles, the couple's family had said they married with mutual consent. Selassie described his spouse as a woman without any malice whatsoever. History and nature. Regency. The extent to which Tafari Makonnen contributed to the movement that would come to depose Ieyasu has been discussed extensively, particularly in Haile Selassie's own detailed account of the matter. Ieyasu was the designated but uncrowned Emperor of Ethiopia from 1913 to 1916. Iyasu's reputation for scandalous behavior and a disrespectful attitude towards the nobles at the court of his grandfather, Menelik II, damaged his reputation. Iyasu's flirtation with Islam was considered treasonous among the Ethiopian Orthodox Christian leadership of the empire. On September 27, 1916, Iyasu was deposed. Contributing to the movement that deposed Iyasu were conservatives such as Tafari Makonnen, Menelik II's longtime Minister of War. The movement to depose Iyasu preferred Tafari, as he attracted support from both progressive and conservative factions. Ultimately, Iyasu was deposed on the grounds of conversion to Islam. In his place, the daughter of Menelik II, the aunt of Iyasu, was named Empress Zudatu, while Tafari was elevated to the rank of Ras and was made heir apparent and crown prince. In the power arrangement that followed, Tafari accepted the role of Regent Plenipotentiary, Bailmulu Indres, and became the de facto ruler of the Ethiopian Empire, Mangista Ethiopia. Zudatu would govern while Tafari would administer. History and nature. While Iyasu had been deposed on September 27, 1916, on October 8 he managed to escape into the Ogaden Desert and his father, Negus Mikhail of Wolo, had time to come to his aid. On October 27, Negus Mikhail and his army met an army under Tafari Makonnen loyal to Zudatu and Tafari. During the Battle of Segal, Mikhail was defeated and captured. Any chance that Iyasu would regain the throne was ended, and he went into hiding. On January 11, 1921, after avoiding capture for about 5 years, Iyasu was taken into custody by Gugsa Haile Selassie. History and nature. Ras Tafari in 1924 at the International Labour Organization. On February 11, 1917, the coronation for Zudatu took place. She pledged to rule justly through her regent, Tafari. While Tafari was the more visible of the two, Zudatu was not simply honorary ruler, but she did have some political restraints due to the reason her position was complex compared to other Ethiopian monarchs. One was that it required that she arbitrate the claims of competing factions. In other words, she had the last word. But unlike other monarchs, Tafari carried the burden of daily administration, but, initially because his position was relatively weak, this was often an exercise in futility. His personal army was poorly equipped, his finances were limited, and he had little leverage to withstand the combined influence of the Empress, the Minister of War, or the provincial governors. Nonetheless, her authority weakened while Tafari's power increased. She focused on praying and fasting and much less in her official duties, which allowed Tafari to later have greater influence than even the Empress. History and nature. During his regency, the new crown prince developed the policy of cautious modernization initiated by Menelik II. Also, during this time, he survived the 1918 flu pandemic, having come down with the illness as someone fairly prone to the effects of disease throughout his life. He secured Ethiopia's admission to the League of Nations in 1923 by promising to eradicate slavery. Each emperor since Tewodros II had issued proclamations to halt slavery, but without effect. The internationally scorned practice persisted well into Haile Selassie's reign with an estimated 2 million slaves in Ethiopia in the early 1930s. History and nature. Travel abroad. With King George V at Buckingham Palace, 1924. In 1924, Ras Tafari toured Europe and the Middle East, visiting Jerusalem, Alexandria, Paris, Luxembourg, Brussels, Amsterdam, Stockholm, London, Geneva, Gibraltar, and Athens. With him on his tour was a group that included Ras Siam Mang Asha of Western Tigray Province, Ras Halutekal Haymanot of Gajajam Province, Ras Mulujata Yegazu of Ilubabor Province, Ras Makonnen Indelkaku, and Bladajita Hiruwelda Selassie. The primary goal of the trip to Europe was for Ethiopia to gain access to the sea. In Paris, Tafari was to find out from the French Foreign Ministry, Quai d'Orsay, that this goal would not be realized. However, failing this, he and his retinue inspected schools, hospitals, factories, and churches. Although patterning many reforms after European models, Tafari remained wary of European pressure. To guard against economic imperialism, Tafari required that all enterprises have at least partial local ownership. Of his modernization campaign, he remarked, "We need European progress only because we are surrounded by it. That is at once a benefit and a misfortune." History and nature. Throughout Tafari's travels in Europe, the Levant, and Egypt, he and his entourage were greeted with enthusiasm and fascination. Siam Mang Asha accompanied him and Halutekal Haymanot who, like Tafari, were sons of generals who contributed to the victorious war against Italy a quarter century earlier at the Battle of Adwa. Another member of his entourage, Mulujita Yegazu, actually fought at Adwa as a young man. The oriental dignity of the Ethiopians and their rich, picturesque court dress were sensationalist in the media. Among his entourage he even included a pride of lions, which he distributed as gifts to President Alexander Milrand and Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré of France, to King George V of the United Kingdom, and to the Zoological Garden, Jardin Zoologique, of Paris, France. As one historian noted, rarely can a tour have inspired so many anecdotes. In return for 2 lions, the United Kingdom presented Tafari with the imperial crown of Emperor Tewodros II for its safe return to Empress Zuditug. The crown had been taken by General Sir Robert Napier during the 1868 expedition to Abyssinia. History and nature. In this period, the Crown Prince visited the Armenian monastery of Jerusalem. There, he adopted 40 Armenian orphans, Arboligic, 40 children, who had lost their parents during the Armenian genocide. Tafari arranged for the musical education of the youths, and they came to form the Imperial Brass Band. History and nature. King and Emperor. Official coronation painting by Beatrice Plain c. 1950s. Tafari's authority was challenged in 1928 when Dejazmach Balcha Safo went to Addis Ababa with a sizable armed force. When Tafari consolidated his hold over the provinces, many of Menelik's appointees refused to abide by the new regulations. Balcha Safo, the governor, Shum, of coffee-rich Sidamo province, was particularly troublesome. The revenues he remitted to the central government did not reflect the accrued profits and Tafari recalled him to Addis Ababa. The old man came in high dudgeon and, insultingly, with a large army. The Dejazmach paid homage to Empress Zuditug, but snubbed Tafari. On February 18, while Balcha Safo and his personal bodyguard NB were in Addis Ababa, Tafari had Ras Kasa Haile Darj buy off his army and arranged to have him displaced as the Shum of Sidamo province by Baru Wolde Gabriel, who himself was replaced by Desta Damtu. History and nature. Even so, the gesture of Balcha Safo empowered Empress Zuditug politically and she attempted to have Tafari tried for treason. He was tried for his benevolent dealings with Italy, including a 20-year peace accord that was signed on August 2. In September, a group of palace reactionaries, including some courtiers of the Empress, made a final bid to get rid of Tafari. The attempted coup d'état was tragic in its origins and comic in its end. When confronted by Tafari and a company of his troops, the ringleaders of the coup took refuge on the palace grounds in Menelik's mausoleum. Tafari and his men surrounded them only to be surrounded themselves by the personal guard of Zuditug. More of Tafari's khaki-clad soldiers arrived and decided the outcome in his favor with superiority of arms. Popular support, as well as the support of the police, remained with Tafari. Ultimately, the Empress relented, and, on October 7, 1928, she crowned Tafari as Negus, Amharic, king. History and nature. The crowning of Tafari as king was controversial. he occupied the same territory as the empress rather than going off to a regional kingdom of the empire. Two monarchs, even with one being the vassal and the other the emperor, in this case empress, had never occupied the same location as their seat in Ethiopian history. Conservatives agitated to redress this perceived insult to the crown's dignity, leading to the rebellion of Ras Gug Savela. Gug Savela was the husband of the empress and the Shum of Bagimdar province. In early 1930, he raised an army and marched it from his governorate at Gondar towards Addis Ababa. On March 31, 1930, Gug Savela was met by forces loyal to Negus Tafari and was defeated at the Battle of Ankem. Gug Savela was killed in action. News of Gug Savela's defeat and death had hardly spread through Addis Ababa when the empress died suddenly on April 2, 1930. Although it was long rumored that the empress was poisoned upon her husband's defeat, or alternately that she died from shock upon hearing of the death of her estranged yet beloved husband, it has since been documented that the empress succumbed to paratyphoid fever and complications from diabetes after the Orthodox clergy imposed strict rules concerning her diet against her physician's orders with regards to Lent. History and nature. Upon Zuditu's death, Tafari himself rose to emperor and was proclaimed Negus Negus I Ethiopia, King of Kings of Ethiopia. He was crowned on November 2, 1930, at Addis Ababa's Cathedral of St. George. The coronation was by all accounts a most splendid affair, and it was attended by royals and dignitaries from all over the world. Among those in attendance were the Duke of Gloucester, King George V's son, Marshal Louis Franchet d'Espira of France, and the Prince of Udine representing King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. Special Ambassador Herman Murray Jacobi attended the coronation as the personal representative of President Herbert Hoover. Other emissaries from Egypt, Turkey, Sweden, Belgium, and Japan were also present. British author Evelyn Waugh was also present, penning a contemporary report on the event, and American travel lecturer Burton Holmes shot the only known film footage of the event. One newspaper report suggested that the celebration had incurred a cost in excess of $3 million. Many of those in attendance received lavish gifts. In one instance, the Christian emperor even sent a gold-encased Bible to an American bishop who had not attended the coronation, but who had dedicated a prayer to the emperor on the day of the coronation. History and Nature. Cover of Time magazine, November 3, 1930. Haile Selassie introduced Ethiopia's first written constitution on July 16, 1931, providing for a bicameral legislature. The constitution kept power in the hands of the nobility, but it did establish democratic standards among the nobility, envisaging a transition to democratic rule. It would prevail until the people are in a position to elect themselves. The constitution limited the succession to the throne to the descendants of Haile Selassie. It virtually made other dynastic princes, including the princes of Tigray and even the emperor's loyal cousin, Ras Kasa Haile Darj, outside of the line of throne. In 1932, the Sultanate of Jimma was formally absorbed into Ethiopia following the death of Sultan Abba Jifar II of Jimma. History and Nature. Conflict with Italy. See also, Abyssinia Crisis and Second Italo-Abyssinian War. Ethiopia became the target of renewed Italian imperialist designs in the 1930s. Benito Mussolini's fascist regime was keen to avenge the military defeats Italy had suffered to Ethiopia in the First Italo-Abyssinian War, and to efface the failed attempt by liberal Italy to conquer the country, as epitomized by the defeat at Adwa. A conquest of Ethiopia could also empower the cause of fascism and embolden its empire's rhetoric. Ethiopia would also provide a bridge between Italy's Eritrean and Italian Somaliland possessions. Ethiopia's position in the League of Nations did not dissuade the Italians from invading in 1935, the collective security envisaged by the League proved useless, and a scandal erupted when the Laval Pact revealed that Ethiopia's League allies were scheming to appease Italy. History and Nature. Mobilization. Following December 5, 1934 Italian invasion of Ethiopia at Welwel, Ogaden Province, Haile Selassie joined his northern armies and set up headquarters at Dis in Wollo Province. he issued his mobilization order on October 3, 1935. If you withhold from your country Ethiopia the death from cough or head cold of which you would otherwise die, refusing to resist, in your district, in your patrimony, and in your home, our enemy who is coming from a distant country to attack us, and if you persist in not shedding your blood, you will be rebuked for it by your Creator and will be cursed by your offspring. Hence, without cooling your heart of accustomed valor, there emerges your decision to fight fiercely, mindful of your history that will last far into the future. If on your march you touch any property inside houses or cattle and crops outside, not even grass, straw and dung excluded, it is like killing your brother who is dying with you. You, countrymen, living at the various access routes, set up a market for the army at the places where it is camping, and on the day your district governor will indicate to you, lest the soldiers campaigning for Ethiopia's liberty should experience difficulty. You will not be charged excise duty, until the end of the campaign, for anything you are marketing at the military camps. I have granted you remission. After you have been ordered to go to war, but are then idly missing from the campaign, and when you are seized by the local chief or by an accuser, you will have punishment inflicted upon your inherited land, your property, and your body. To the accuser I shall grant 1/3 of your property. History and Nature. On October 19, 1935, Haile Selassie gave more precise orders for his army to his commander-in-chief, Ras Kassah. When you set up tents, it is to be in caves and by trees and in a wood, if the place happens to be adjoining to these and separated in the various platoons. Tents are to be set up at a distance of 30 cubits from each other. When an aeroplane is sighted, one should leave large open roads and wide meadows and march in valleys and trenches and by zigzag routes, along places that have trees and woods. When an aeroplane comes to drop bombs, it will not suit it to do so unless it comes down to about 100 meters, hence when it flies low for such action, one should fire a volley with a good and very long gun and then quickly disperse. When 3 or 4 bullets have hit it, the aeroplane is bound to fall down. But let only those fire who have been ordered to shoot with a weapon that has been selected for such firing, for if everyone shoots who possesses a gun, there is no advantage in this except to waste bullets and to disclose the men's whereabouts. Lest the aeroplane, when rising again, should detect the whereabouts of those who are dispersed, it is well to remain cautiously scattered as long as it is still fairly close. In time of war it suits the enemy to aim his guns at adorned shields, ornaments, silver and gold cloaks, silk shirts, and similar things. Whether one possesses a jacket or not, it is best to wear a narrow-sleeved shirt with faded colors. When we return, with God's help, you can wear your gold and silver decorations then. Now it is time to go and fight. We offer you all these words of advice in the hope that no great harm should befall you through lack of caution. At the same time, we are glad to assure you that in time of war, we are ready to shed our blood in your midst for the sake of Ethiopia's freedom. History and Nature. On a horse before the war, 1935. Compared to the Ethiopians, the Italians had an advanced, modern military that included a large air force. The Italians would also come to employ chemical weapons extensively throughout the conflict, even targeting Red Cross field hospitals in violation of the Geneva Conventions. History and Nature. Progress of the war. Starting in early October 1935, the Italians invaded Ethiopia. But, by November, the pace of invasion had slowed appreciably, and Haile Selassie's northern armies were able to launch what was known as the Christmas Offensive. During this offensive, the Italians were forced back in places and put on the defensive. In early 1936, the First Battle of Tembien stopped the progress of the Ethiopian offensive and the Italians were ready to continue their offensive. Following the defeat and destruction of the northern Ethiopian armies at the Battle of Amba Eratum, the Second Battle of Tembien, and the Battle of Shire, Haile Selassie took the field with the last Ethiopian army on the northern front. On March 31, 1936, he launched a counterattack against the Italians himself at the Battle of Machu in southern Tigray. The emperor's army was defeated and retreated in disarray. As Haile Selassie's army withdrew, the Italians attacked from the air along with rebellious Rhea and Azabo tribesmen on the ground, who were armed and paid by the Italians. Many of the Ethiopian military were obsolete compared to the invading Italian forces, possessing mostly untrained and non-modern rifles and weaponry. History and nature. Haile Selassie made a solitary pilgrimage to the churches at Lalibela, at considerable risk of capture, before returning to his capital. After a stormy session of the Council of State, it was agreed that because Addis Ababa could not be defended, the government would relocate to the southern town of Gore, and that in the interest of preserving the imperial house, the emperor's wife Manan Asfa and the rest of the imperial family should immediately depart for French Somaliland, and from there continue on to Jerusalem. History and nature. Exile debate. The emperor arrives in Jerusalem. May 1936. After further debate as to whether Haile Selassie should go to Gore or accompany his family into exile, it was agreed that he should leave Ethiopia with his family and present the case of Ethiopia to the League of Nations at Geneva. The decision was not unanimous and several participants, including the nobleman Bladatekel Wolde Hawariat, strenuously objected to the idea of an Ethiopian monarch fleeing before an invading force. Haile Selassie appointed his cousin Ras Imru Haile Selassie as Prince Regent in his absence, departing with his family for French Somaliland on May 2, 1936. History and nature. On May 5, Marshal Pietro Badoglio led Italian troops into Addis Ababa, and Mussolini declared Ethiopia an Italian province. Victor Emmanuel III was proclaimed as the new Emperor of Ethiopia. On the previous day, the Ethiopian exiles had left French Somaliland aboard the British cruiser HMS Enterprise. They were bound for Jerusalem in the British Mandate of Palestine, where the Ethiopian imperial family maintained a residence. The family disembarked at Haifa and then went on to Jerusalem. Once there, Haile Selassie and his retinue prepared to make their case at Geneva. The choice of Jerusalem was highly symbolic, since the Solomonic dynasty claimed descent from the House of David. Leaving the Holy Land, Haile Selassie and his entourage sailed aboard the British cruiser HMS Cape Town for Gibraltar, where he stayed at the Rock Hotel. From Gibraltar, the exiles were transferred to an ordinary liner. By doing this, the United Kingdom government was spared the expense of a state reception. History and nature. Collective Security and the League of Nations, 1936. Main article, Haile Selassie's speech to the League of Nations, 1936. Haile Selassie at the League of Nations appealing Italy's invasion in 1936. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia and promptly declared his own Italian empire. After the League of Nations afforded Haile Selassie the opportunity to address the Assembly, Italy withdrew its League delegation, on May 12, 1936. It was in this context that Haile Selassie walked into the Hall of the League of Nations, introduced by the President of the Assembly as His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Sa Majest Imperiale, El Emperor di Ethiopia. The introduction caused a great many Italian journalists in the galleries to erupt into jeering, heckling, and whistling. As it turned out, they had earlier been issued whistles by Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Galizio Ciano. The Romanian delegate and former League president, Nicolae Ticulescu, famously jumped to his feet in response and cried to the door with the savages, and the offending journalists were removed from the hall. Haile Selassie waited calmly for the hall to be cleared, and responded majestically with a speech considered by some among the most stirring of the 20th century, and a possible warning for future generations. Although fluent in French, the League's working language, Haile Selassie chose to deliver his historic speech in his native Amharic. He asserted that, because his confidence in the League was absolute, his people were now being slaughtered. He pointed out that the same European states that found in Ethiopia's favor at the League of Nations were refusing Ethiopia credit and materiel while aiding Italy, which was employing chemical weapons on military and civilian targets alike. It was at the time when the operations for the encircling of Mekelle were taking place that the Italian command, fearing a rout, followed the procedure that it is now my duty to denounce to the world. Special sprayers were installed on board aircraft so that they could vaporize, over vast areas of territory, a fine, death-dealing rain. Groups of 9, 15, 18 aircraft followed one another so that the fog issuing from them formed a continuous sheet. It was thus that, as from the end of January 1936, soldiers, women, children, cattle, rivers, lakes, and pastures were drenched continually with this deadly rain. In order to kill off systematically all living creatures, in order to more surely poison waters and pastures, the Italian command made its aircraft pass over and over again. That was its chief method of warfare. Noting that his own small people of 12 million inhabitants, without arms, without resources, could never withstand an attack by a large power such as Italy, with its 42 million people and unlimited quantities of the most death-dealing weapons, he contended that the aggression threatened all small states, and that all small states were in effect reduced to vassal states in the absence of collective action. He admonished the League that God and history will remember your judgment. It is collective security, it is the very existence of the League of Nations. It is the confidence that each state is to place in international treaties. In a word, it is international morality that is at stake. Have the signatures appended to a treaty value only insofar as the signatory powers have a personal, direct, and immediate interest involved? At the beginning of 1936, Time had named him Man of the Year for 1935, and his June 1936 speech made the Emperor an icon for anti-fascists around the world. He failed, however, to get what he most needed. The League agreed to only partial and ineffective sanctions on Italy. Only 6 nations in 1937 did not recognize Italy's occupation: China, New Zealand, the Soviet Union, the Republic of Spain, Mexico, and the United States. It is often said one of the many reasons the League of Nations effectively collapsed was due to its failure to condemn Italy's invasion of Abyssinia. Despite this international praise, Selassie was left without much needed military equipment. Upon his return to Ethiopia, it was primarily his military cunning and strategy that led him to defeat Italy. For example, Ethiopian troops were able to successfully raid Italian weapons stores and used pack animals to carry artillery over rugged terrain in order to position themselves to ambush Italian troops in areas they were not prepared to fight. History and nature. Exile. Fairfield House, Bath, was Selassie's residence for 5 years during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War and parts of World War II. Haile Selassie spent his exile years, 1936 to 1941, in Bath, England, in Fairfield House, which he bought. The Emperor and Casa Haile Darge took morning walks together behind the 14-room Victorian house's high walls. Haile Selassie's favorite reading was diplomatic history. But most of his serious hours were occupied with the 90,000-word story of his life that he was laboriously writing in Amharic. History and nature. Prior to Fairfield House, he briefly stayed at Warren's Hotel in Worthing and in Parkside, Wimbledon. A bust of Haile Selassie by Hilda Seligman stood in nearby Canizaro Park to commemorate this time, and was a popular place of pilgrimage for London's Rastafari community, until it was destroyed by protesters on June 30, 2020. Haile Selassie stayed at the Abbey Hotel in Malvern in the 1930s, and his granddaughters and daughters of court officials were educated at Clarendon School for Girls in North Malvern. During his time in Malvern, he attended services at Holy Trinity Church, in Linktop. A blue plaque, commemorating his stay in Malvern, was unveiled on Saturday, June 25, 2011. As part of the ceremony, a delegation from the Rastafari movement gave a short address and a drum recital. History and nature. Haile Selassie, with Brigadier Daniel Sandford, left, and Colonel Wingate, right, in Dambaka Fort, after its capture, April 15, 1941. Haile Selassie's activity in this period was focused on countering Italian propaganda as to the state of Ethiopian resistance and the legality of the occupation. He spoke out against the desecration of houses of worship and historical artifacts, including the theft of a 1,600-year-old imperial obelisk, and condemned the atrocities suffered by the Ethiopian civilian population. He continued to plead for League intervention and to voice his certainty that God's judgment will eventually visit the weak and the mighty alike, though his attempts to gain support for the struggle against Italy were largely unsuccessful until Italy entered World War II on the German side in June 1940. History and nature. The emperor's pleas for international support did take root in the United States, particularly among African American organizations sympathetic to the Ethiopian cause. In 1937, Haile Selassie was to give a Christmas Day radio address to the American people to thank his supporters when his taxi was involved in a traffic accident, leaving him with a fractured knee. Rather than canceling the radio broadcast, he delivered the address, in which he linked Christianity and goodwill with the covenant of the League of Nations, and asserted that war is not the only means to stop war. With the birth of the Son of God, an unprecedented, an unrepeatable, and a long-anticipated phenomenon occurred. He was born in a stable instead of a palace, in a manger instead of a crib. The hearts of the wise men were struck by fear and wonder due to his majestic humbleness. The kings prostrate themselves before him and worshipped him. Peace be to those who have good will. This became the first message. History and nature. Although the toils of wise people may earn them respect, it is a fact of life that the spirit of the wicked continues to cast its shadow on this world. The arrogant are seen visibly leading their people into crime and destruction. The laws of the League of Nations are constantly violated and wars and acts of aggression repeatedly take place. So that the spirit of the cursed will not gain predominance over the human race whom Christ redeemed with his blood, all peace-loving people should cooperate to stand firm in order to preserve and promote lawfulness and peace. During this period, Haile Selassie suffered several personal tragedies. His two sons-in-law, Ras Desta Damtu and Djazmach Bayanimrid, were both executed by the Italians. The emperor's daughter, Princess Romaine Work, wife of Djazmach Bayanimrid, was herself taken into captivity with her children, and she died in Italy in 1941. His daughter Tsahai died during childbirth shortly after the restoration in 1942. After his return to Ethiopia, he donated Fairfield House to the city of Bath as a residence for the aged. In 2019, two further blue plaques commemorating his residence at Fairfield and his visits to nearby Weston-super-Mare were unveiled by his grandson. History and nature. 1940s and 1950s. Haile Selassie in 1942. British forces, which consisted primarily of Ethiopian-backed African and South African colonial troops under the Gideon force of Colonel Ord Wingate, coordinated the military effort to liberate Ethiopia. The emperor himself issued several imperial proclamations in this period, demonstrating that, while authority was not divided up in any formal way, British military might and the emperor's populist appeal could be joined in the concerted effort to liberate Ethiopia. On January 18, 1941, during the East African Campaign, Haile Selassie crossed the border between Sudan and Ethiopia near the village of Umidla. The standard of the Lion of Judah was raised again. 2 days later, he and a force of Ethiopian patriots joined Gideon force, which was already in Ethiopia and preparing the way. History and nature. Meeting with Crown Prince Akihito and Crown Princess Michiko in 1955. Italy was defeated by a force of the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth of Nations, Free France, Free Belgium, and Ethiopian patriots. On May 5, 1941, Haile Selassie entered Addis Ababa and personally addressed the Ethiopian people, exactly 5 years after the fascist forces entered Addis Ababa. Today is the day on which we defeated our enemy. Therefore, when we say let us rejoice with our hearts, let not our rejoicing be in any other way but in the Spirit of Christ. Do not return evil for evil. Do not indulge in the atrocities that the enemy has been practicing in his usual way, even to the last. Take care not to spoil the good name of Ethiopia by acts that are worthy of the enemy. We shall see that our enemies are disarmed and sent out the same way they came. As Saint George who killed the dragon is the patron saint of our army as well as of our allies, let us unite with our allies in everlasting friendship and amity in order to be able to stand against the godless and cruel dragon that has newly risen and that is oppressing humankind. On August 27, 1942, Haile Selassie confirmed the legal basis for the abolition of slavery that had been illegally enacted by Italian occupying forces throughout the empire and imposed severe penalties, including death, for slave trading. After World War II, Ethiopia became a charter member of the United Nations. In 1948, the Ogaden, a region disputed with both Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland, was granted to Ethiopia. On December 2, 1950, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 390, v. establishing the Federation of Eritrea, the former Italian colony, into Ethiopia. History and Nature. Queen Elizabeth II with Emperor Haile Selassie heading towards to Buckingham Palace in 1954. Eritrea was to have its own constitution, which would provide for ethnic, linguistic, and cultural balance, while Ethiopia was to manage its finances, defense, and foreign policy. Despite his centralization policies that had been made before World War II, Haile Selassie still found himself unable to push for all the programs he wanted. In 1942, he attempted to institute a progressive tax scheme, but this failed due to opposition from the nobility, and only a flat tax was passed. In 1951, he agreed to reduce this as well. Ethiopia was still semi-feudal, and the emperor's attempts to alter its social and economic form by reforming its modes of taxation met with resistance from the nobility and clergy, which were eager to resume their privileges in the post-war era. Where Haile Selassie actually did succeed in effecting new land taxes, the burdens were often still passed by the landowners to the peasants. History and Nature. Haile Selassie I with U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on board the USS Quincy, CA-71, in Egypt after the Yalta Conference on February 13, 1945. Selassie with Sir Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Downing Street, on October 22, 1954. Between 1941 and 1959, Haile Selassie worked to establish the autocephaly of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church had been headed by the Abuna, a bishop who answered to the Pope of the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria. In 1942 and 1945, Haile Selassie applied to the Holy Synod of the Coptic Orthodox Church to establish the independence of Ethiopian bishops, and when his appeals were denied he threatened to sever relations with the Coptic Church of Alexandria. Finally, in 1959, Pope Kyrillos VI elevated the Abuna to Patriarch Catholicos. The Ethiopian Church remained affiliated with the Alexandrian Church. In addition to these efforts, Haile Selassie changed the Ethiopian church-state relationship by introducing taxation of church lands, and by restricting the legal privileges of the clergy, who had formerly been tried in their own courts for civil offences. In 1956 on a state visit to India he met with Indian leaders who supported Ethiopia against fascist Italy's illegal occupation during the 1935–1941 war against the country. He also discussed with Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru relating to Asian and African decolonization and cooperation between economic and education sectors. In 1948, the Harari Muslims of Harar with Somali allies staged a significant rebellion against the empire. The state responded violently. Hundreds were arrested and the entire town of Harar was put under house arrest. The government also took control of many assets and estates belonging to the people. This led to a massive exodus of Hararis from the Harari region, which had not occurred in their history prior. The dissatisfaction of the Harari stemmed from the fact that they had never received limited autonomy of Harar, which was promised by Menelik II after his conquest of the kingdom. The promise was eroded by successive Amhara governors. According to historians Tim Carmichael and Roman Loimeyer, Haile Selassie was directly involved in the suppression of the Harari movement that formed as a response to the crackdown on Hararis who collaborated with the Italians during their occupation of Ethiopia from 1935 to 1941. Nearly 2 decades ago, I personally assumed before history the responsibility of placing the fate of my beloved people on the issue of collective security, for surely, at that time and for the first time in world history, that issue was posed in all its clarity. My searching of conscience convinced me of the rightness of my course, and if, after untold sufferings and, indeed, unaided resistance at the time of aggression, we now see the final vindication of that principle in our joint action in Korea, I can only be thankful that God gave me strength to persist in our faith until the moment of its recent glorious vindication. Haile Selassie I. In keeping with the principle of collective security, for which he was an outspoken proponent, Haile Selassie sent a contingent, under General Mulugeta Buli, known as the Kagnu Battalion, to take part in the Korean War by supporting the United Nations Command. It was attached to the American 7th Infantry Division, and fought in a number of engagements including the Battle of Pork Chop Hill. In a 1954 speech, Haile Selassie spoke of Ethiopian participation in the Korean War as a redemption of the principles of collective security. During the celebrations of his Silver Jubilee in November 1955, Haile Selassie introduced a revised constitution, whereby he retained effective power, while extending political participation to the people by allowing the lower house of parliament to become an elected body. Party politics were not provided for. Modern educational methods were more widely. History and nature. The country embarked on a development scheme and plans for modernization, tempered by Ethiopian traditions, and within the framework of the state's ancient monarchical structure. Haile Selassie compromised, when practical, with the traditionalists in the nobility and church. He also tried to improve relations between the state and ethnic groups, and granted autonomy to Afar lands that were difficult to control. Still, his reforms to end feudalism were slow and weakened by the compromises he made with the entrenched aristocracy. The revised constitution of 1955 has been criticized for reasserting the indisputable power of the monarch and maintaining the relative powerlessness of the peasants. History and nature. Haile Selassie photographed with Nikita Khrushchev, General Secretary of the Soviet Union at Moscow in 1959. Haile Selassie also maintained cordial relations with the government of the United Kingdom through charitable gestures. He sent aid to the British government in 1947 when Britain was affected by heavy flooding. His letter to Lord Mayor, National Distress Fund, London said, "Even though we are busy of helping our people who didn't recover from the crises of the war, we heard that your fertile and beautiful country is devastated by the unusually heavy rain, and your request for aid. Therefore, we are sending small amount of money, about £1,000 through our embassy to show our sympathy and cooperation." He also left his home in exile, Fairfield House, Bath, to the city of Bath for the use of the aged in 1959. Since 1955, the emperor's power was decentralized from him to the prime minister and council of ministers who were elected from their constituents. 1958 Famine of Tigray. In the summer of 1958, a widespread famine in the Tigray province of northern Ethiopia was already 2 years old, yet people in Addis Ababa knew hardly anything about it. When significant reports of death finally reached the Ministry of Interior in September 1959, the central government immediately disclosed the information to the public and began asking for contributions. The emperor personally donated 2,000 tons of relief grain, the US sent 32,000 tons, which was distributed between Eritrea and Tigray, and money for aid was raised throughout the country, but it is estimated that approximately 100,000 people had died before the crisis ended in August 1961. The causes of the famine were attributed to drought, locusts, hailstone, and epidemics of smallpox, typhus, measles and malaria. History and nature. 1960s. Haile Selassie with U.S. President John F. Kennedy, October 1963. Haile Selassie contributed Ethiopian troops to the United Nations operation in the Congo peacekeeping force during the 1960 Congo crisis, to preserve Congolese integrity, per United Nations Security Council Resolution 143. On December 13, 1960, while Haile Selassie was on a state visit to Brazil, his Kaburzabigna, Imperial Guard, forces staged an unsuccessful coup, briefly proclaiming Haile Selassie's eldest son Asfa Wosan as emperor. The regular army and police forces crushed the coup d'état. The coup attempt lacked broad popular support, was denounced by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and was unpopular with the army, air force, and police. Nonetheless, the effort to depose the emperor had support among students and the educated classes. The coup attempt has been characterized as a pivotal moment in Ethiopian history, the point at which Ethiopians for the first time questioned the power of the king to rule without the people's consent. Student populations began to empathize with the peasantry and poor and advocate on their behalf. The coup spurred Haile Selassie to accelerate reform, which was manifested in the form of land grants to military and police officials and political groups. History and nature. A UN plebiscite voted 46-10 to have Eritrea be federated with Ethiopia, which was later stipulated on December 2, 1950 in Resolution 390, v. Eritrea would have its own parliament and administration and would be represented in what had been the Ethiopian parliament and would become the federal parliament. Haile Selassie would have none of the European attempts to draft a separate constitution under which Eritrea would be governed, and wanted his own 1955 constitution protecting families to apply in both Ethiopia and Eritrea. In 1961 the 30-year Eritrean struggle for independence began, followed by the dissolution of the federation and shutting down of Eritrea's parliament. Haile Selassie with President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt in Addis Ababa for the Organization of African Unity Summit, 1963. In September 1961, Haile Selassie attended the Conference of Heads of State of Government of Non-Aligned Countries in Belgrade, FPR Yugoslavia. This is considered to be the founding conference of the non-aligned movement. In 1961, tensions between independence-minded Eritreans and Ethiopian forces culminated in the Eritrean War of Independence. Eritrea's elected parliament voted to become the 14th province of Ethiopia in 1962. The war would continue for 30 years, first Haile Selassie, then the Soviet-backed junta that succeeded him, attempted to retain Eritrea by force. Wikisource has original text related to this article. Haile Selassie's Address to the United Nations, 1963. In 1963, Haile Selassie presided over the formation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, the precursor of the continent-wide African Union, O. The new organization would establish its headquarters in Addis Ababa. In May of that year, Haile Selassie was elected as the OAU's first official chairperson, a rotating seat. Along with Modibo Keita of Mali, the Ethiopian leader would later help successfully negotiate the Bamako Accords, which brought an end to the border conflict between Morocco and Algeria. In 1964, Haile Selassie would initiate the concept of the United States of Africa, a proposition later taken up by Muammar Gaddafi. Also in 1963 Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, allegedly helped Selassie to put his grandson in the elite Gordonstown school by pulling the strings. In 1963 a revolt in Bale occurred, where peasant rioters whom were discouraged by the Ethiopian taxation headed by Prime Minister Akla Habwold later turned into an insurgency. This caused a semi-civil war with terrorist activities carried out by rebels supported by Somalia, which later forced the Ethiopian government to declare a state of emergency. The emperor's armed forces led by Prime Minister Aklalu's cabinet with the support of the United Kingdom and the United States able to finally end it after over 6 years of insurgency. This assured weakened diplomatic ties with Siad Barre's Somalia. On October 4, 1963, Haile Selassie addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations, referring in his address to his earlier speech to the League of Nations. 27 years ago, as Emperor of Ethiopia, I mounted the rostrum in Geneva, Switzerland, to address the League of Nations and to appeal for relief from the destruction that had been unleashed against my defenseless nation, by the fascist invader. I spoke then both to and for the conscience of the world. My words went unheeded, but history testifies to the accuracy of the warning that I gave in 1936. Today, I stand before the world organization that has succeeded to the mantle discarded by its discredited predecessor. In this body is enshrined the principle of collective security that I unsuccessfully invoked at Geneva. Here, in this assembly, reposes the best, perhaps the last, hope for the peaceful survival of humankind. History and Nature. Haile Selassie I in the state funeral of U.S. President John F. Kennedy on November 25, 1963. On November 25, 1963, the Emperor was among other heads of state, including France's President Charles de Gaulle and Belgium's King Baudouin, who traveled to Washington, D.C., and attended the funeral of assassinated President John F. Kennedy. Haile Selassie was the only African head of state to attend the funeral. In addition, he was also the only one of the three prominent world leaders, de Gaulle, Baudouin, and Selassie, that would have another meeting with the new President Lyndon B. Johnson. In Washington during his presidency, the two would meet on Johnson's first day in the Oval Office of the White House and again during an informal visit to the United States in 1967. History and Nature. Selassie with Queen Elizabeth II in Addis Ababa on her 1965 state visit to Ethiopia. In 1966, Haile Selassie attempted to replace the historical tax system with a single progressive income tax, which would significantly weaken the nobility who had previously avoided paying most of their taxes. Even with alterations, this law led to a revolt in Gajajam, which was repressed although enforcement of the tax was abandoned. Having achieved its design in undermining the tax, the revolt encouraged other landowners to defy Haile Selassie. History and Nature. In October of the same year, Haile Selassie had a 4-day visit to the Kingdom of Jordan hosted by King Hussein. During this trip, Haile Selassie visited Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where Jesus is believed to have been crucified and buried. While he had fully approved and assured Ethiopia's participation in unapproved collective security operations, including Korea and Congo, Haile Selassie drew a distinction between it and the non-unapproved foreign intervention in Indochina, consistently deploring it as needless suffering and calling for the Vietnam War to end on several occasions. At the same time he remained open toward the United States and commended it for making progress with African American civil rights legislation in the 1950s and 1960s, while visiting the U.S. several times during these years. In 1967, he visited Montreal, Canada, to open the Ethiopian Pavilion at the Expo 67 World's Fair where he received great acclaim among other world leaders there for the occasion. History and Nature. Selassie with U.S. President Richard Nixon in July 1969 at the White House. Student unrest became a regular feature of Ethiopian life in the 1960s and 1970s. Communism took root in large segments of the Ethiopian intelligentsia, particularly among those who had studied abroad and had thus been exposed to radical and left-wing sentiments that were becoming popular in other parts of the globe. Resistance by conservative elements at the imperial court and parliament, and by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, made Haile Selassie's land reform proposals difficult to implement, and also damaged the standing of the government, costing Haile Selassie much of the goodwill he had once enjoyed. This bred resentment among the peasant population. Efforts to weaken unions also hurt his image. As these issues began to pile up, Haile Selassie left much of domestic governance to his prime minister, Akhluluhabd Wold, and concentrated more on foreign affairs. Over the last 2 decades beforehand and during the 60s, Ethiopia had received over $400 million in aid, 140 million of that being for the Ethiopian military, and 240 million for economic assistance. History and Nature. 1970s. Haile Selassie I in Beijing, China with Chinese leader and chairman of the CCP Mao Zedong in 1971. Selassie also met Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai in his state visit. Outside of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie continued to enjoy enormous prestige and respect. As the longest-serving head of state in power, he was often given precedence over other leaders at state events, such as the state funerals of John F. Kennedy and Charles de Gaulle, the summits of the Non-Aligned Movement, and the 1971 celebration of the 2,500 years of the Persian Empire. In 1970 he visited Italy as a guest of President Giuseppe Saragat, and in Milan he met Giordano Della More, president of Italian Savings Banks Association. He visited China in October 1971, and was the first foreign head of state to meet Mao Zedong following the death of Mao's designated successor Lin Biao in a plane crash in Mongolia. Civil liberties and political rights were low, with Freedom House giving Ethiopia a not free score for both civil liberties and political rights in the last years of Haile Selassie's rule. Common human rights abuses included imprisonment and torture of political dissidents and very poor prison conditions. Nonetheless, it is to be noted the emperor was known for pardoning hundreds of prisoners at a time, and there were no more than 10 political prisoners during his entire reign. History and nature. His entire reign. Selassie with Pope Paul VI at the Holy See on November 10, 1970. The Imperial Ethiopian Army also carried out a number of atrocities while fighting the Eritrean separatists. There were a number of mass killings of hundreds of civilians during the war in the late 1960s and early 1970s. History and nature. He also went to Vatican City to meet Pope Paul VI on 1970, where they discussed issues regarding both their countries and history. Selassie's political influence was huge. He kept an eye on Ethiopia's political status through 4 spy agencies, all which coherently spy on each other and civilian and military aspects of the nation. He was the only person who held the true scope of things in Ethiopia. History and nature. Duration, 8 minutes and 2 seconds. 8:02. Selassie's speech regarding human rights on October 23, 1970, which marked the 25th anniversary for the United Nations founding. Wollo famine. Main article, 1973 to 1975. Wollo famine. Famine mostly in Wollo, northeastern Ethiopia, as well as in some parts of Tigray, is estimated to have killed 40,000 to 80,000 Ethiopians between 1972 and 1974. A BBC News report has cited a 1973 estimate that 200,000 deaths occurred, based on a contemporaneous estimate from the Ethiopian Nutrition Institute. While this figure is still repeated in some texts and media sources, it was an estimate that was later found to be over-pessimistic. Although the region is infamous for recurrent crop failures and continuous food shortage and starvation risk, this episode was remarkably severe. A 1973 production of the ITV program The Unknown Famine by Jonathan Dimbleby relied on the unverified estimate of 200,000 dead, stimulating a massive influx of aid while at the same time destabilizing Haile Selassie's administration. Against that background, a group of dissident army officers instigated a creeping coup against the emperor's faltering regime. To guard against a public backlash in favor of Haile Selassie, who was still widely revered, they contrived to obtain a copy of The Unknown Famine that they intercut with images of Africa's grand old man presiding at a wedding feast in the grounds of his palace. Retitled The Hidden Hunger, this film noir was shown around the clock on Ethiopian television to coincide with the day that they finally summoned the nerve to seize the emperor himself. Jonathan Dimbleby, feeding on Ethiopia's famine. Ethiopia's population and GDP per capita growth during a part of Selassie's reign from 1950 to 1973. The land distribution throughout the Ethiopian Empire to nobles throughout each region. Some reports suggest that the emperor was unaware of the famine's extent, while others assert that he was well aware of it. In addition to the exposure of attempts by corrupt local officials to cover up the famine from the imperial government, the Kremlin's depiction of Haile Selassie's Ethiopia as backwards and inept, relative to the purported utopia of Marxism, Leninism, contributed to the popular uprising that led to its downfall and the rise of Mengistu Haile Mariam. The famine and its image in the media undermined the government's popular support, and Haile Selassie's once unassailable personal popularity fell. The crisis was exacerbated by military mutinies and high oil prices, the latter a result of the 1973 oil crisis. The international economic crisis triggered by the oil crisis caused the costs of imported goods, gasoline, and food to skyrocket, while unemployment spiked. Revolution. Main article, Ethiopian Revolution. In February 1974, 4 days of serious riots in Addis Ababa against a sudden economic inflation left 5 dead. The emperor responded by announcing on national television a reduction in petrol prices and a freeze on the cost of basic commodities. This calmed the public, but the promised 33% military wage hike was not substantial enough to pacify the army, which then mutinied, beginning in Asmara and spreading throughout the empire. This mutiny led to the resignation of Prime Minister Akhlelu Habbold on February 27, 1974. Haile Selassie again went on television to agree to the army's demands for still greater pay, and named Tafari Makonnen as his new prime minister. Despite Ndakachu's many concessions, discontent continued in March with a 4-day general strike that paralyzed the nation. History and Nature. Imprisonment. Main article, 1974 Ethiopian coup d'état. Much of the royal family seen behind, fled the country, were imprisoned or executed. Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown on September 12, 1974 when the Derg took power through a coup d'état. The Derg, a committee of low-ranking military officers and enlisted men, set up in June to investigate the military's demands, took advantage of the government's disarray to depose the 82-year-old Haile Selassie on September 12. General Amon Mikhail Endem, a Protestant of Eritrean origin, served briefly as provisional head of state pending the return of Crown Prince Asfa Wosen, who was then receiving medical treatment abroad. Haile Selassie was placed under house arrest briefly at the 4th Army Division in Addis Ababa. At the same time, most of his family was detained at the late Duke of Harar's residence in the north of the capital. The last months of the emperor's life were spent in imprisonment, in the Grand Palace. Later, most of the imperial family was imprisoned in the Addis Ababa prison Kirchali, also known as Alam Bekigni, or I've had enough of this world. On November 23, 60 former high officials of the imperial government were executed by firing squad without trial, which included Haile Selassie's grandson Iskander Desta, a rear admiral, as well as General Endem and 2 former prime ministers. These killings, known to Ethiopians as Black Saturday, were condemned by Crown Prince Asfa Wosen. The Derg responded to his rebuke by revoking its acknowledgement of his imperial legitimacy, and announcing the end of the Solomonic dynasty. Murder and burial. The tombs of Emperor Haile Selassie and Empress Menon Asfa. The tombs of Haile Selassie and his wife, Menon Asfa, inside the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa. On August 27, 1975, Haile Selassie was murdered by military officers of the Derg regime, a fact that remained undiscovered for another 20 years. On August 28, 1975, state media reported that Haile Selassie had died on August 27 of respiratory failure following complications from a prostate examination followed up by a prostate operation. Dr. Ashrat Woldis denied that complications had occurred and rejected the government version of his death. The prostate operation in question apparently had taken place months before the state media claimed, and Haile Selassie had apparently enjoyed strong health in his last days. In 1994, an Ethiopian court found several former military officers guilty of strangling the emperor in his bed in 1975. 3 years after the military socialist Derg regime was overthrown, the court charged them with genocide and murder, claiming that it had obtained documents attesting to a high-level order from the military regime to assassinate Haile Selassie for leading a feudal regime. Documents have been widely circulated online showing the Derg's final assassination order and bearing the military regime seal and signature. The veracity of these documents has been corroborated by multiple former members of the military Derg regime. The Soviet-backed People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the Derg's successor, fell in 1991. In 1992, Haile Selassie's bones were found under a concrete slab on the palace grounds. Haile Selassie's coffin rested in Bata Church for nearly a decade, near his great-uncle Menelik II's resting place. On November 5, 2000, the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa gave him a funeral, but the government refused calls to declare the ceremony an official imperial funeral. This may have been due to the government's lack of giving encouragement and subtle political recognition to royalists. Prominent Rastafari figures such as Rita Marley participated in the funeral, but most Rastafari rejected the event and refused to accept that the bones were Haile Selassie's remains. There is some debate within the Rastafari movement whether he actually died in 1975. History and Nature. Rastafari Messiah. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Psalm 68:31. Wearing a traditional Ethiopian cape while watching a football match in Haile Selassie I Stadium. Today, Haile Selassie is worshipped as God incarnate among some followers of the Rastafari movement, taken from Haile Selassie's pre-imperial name Ras meaning head, a title looking equivalent to Duke Tafari Makonnen, which emerged in Jamaica during the 1930s under the influence of Leonard Howell, a follower of Marcus Garvey's African redemption movement. He is viewed as the Messiah who will lead the peoples of Africa and the African diaspora to freedom. His official titles are Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah and King of Kings of Ethiopia, Lord of Lords and Elect of God, and his traditional lineage is thought to be from Solomon and Sheba. These notions are perceived by Rastafari as confirmation of the return of the Messiah in the prophetic book of Revelation in the New Testament, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, and Root of David. Rastafari faith in the incarnate divinity of Haile Selassie began after news reports of his coronation reached Jamaica, particularly via the two-time magazine articles on the coronation the week before and the week after the event. Haile Selassie's own perspectives permeate the philosophy of the movement. In 1961, the Jamaican government sent a delegation composed of both Rastafari and non-Rastafari leaders to Ethiopia to discuss the matter of repatriation, among other issues, with the emperor. He reportedly told the Rastafari delegation, which included Mortimer Plano, "Tell the brethren to be not dismayed, I personally will give my assistance in the matter of repatriation." Haile Selassie visited Jamaica on April 21, 1966, and approximately 100,000 Rastafari from all over Jamaica descended on Palisadoes Airport in Kingston to greet him. Spliffs and chalices were openly smoked, causing a haze of ganja smoke to drift through the air. Haile Selassie arrived at the airport but was unable to come down the airplane's mobile steps, as the crowd rushed the tarmac. He then returned into the plane, disappearing for several more minutes. Finally, Jamaican authorities were obliged to request Ras Mortimer Plano, a well-known Rasta leader, to climb the steps, enter the plane, and negotiate the emperor's descent. Plano re-emerged and announced to the crowd, "The emperor has instructed me to tell you to be calm. Step back and let the emperor land." This day is widely held by scholars to be a major turning point for the movement, and it is still commemorated by Rastafari as Gru Nation Day, the anniversary of which is celebrated as the second holiest holiday after November 2, the Emperor's Coronation Day. Selassie facing towards the view c. 1965. From then on, as a result of Plano's actions, the Jamaican authorities were asked to ensure that Rastafari representatives were present at all state functions attended by the emperor, and Rastafari elders also ensured that they obtained a private audience with the emperor, where he reportedly told them that they should not emigrate to Ethiopia until they had first liberated the people of Jamaica. This dictum came to be known as liberation before repatriation. Haile Selassie defied expectations of the Jamaican authorities and never rebuked the Rastafari for their belief in him as God. Instead, he presented the movement's faithful elders with gold medallions, the only recipients of such an honor on this visit. During PNP leader, later Jamaican Prime Minister, Michael Manley's visit to Ethiopia in October 1969, the emperor allegedly still recalled his 1966 reception with amazement, and stated that he felt that he had to be respectful of their beliefs. This was the visit when Manly received the rod of correction or rod of Joshua as a present from the emperor, which is thought to have helped him to win the 1972 election in Jamaica. Rita Marley, Bob Marley's wife, converted to the Rastafari faith after seeing Haile Selassie on his Jamaican trip. She claimed in interviews, and in her book No Woman, No Cry, that she saw a stigmata print on the palm of Haile Selassie's hand as he waved to the crowd, which resembled the markings on Christ's hands from being nailed to the cross, a claim that was not supported by other sources, but was used as evidence for her and other Rastafari to suggest that Haile Selassie I was indeed their Messiah. Rastafari became much better known throughout much of the world due to the popularity of Bob Marley. Bob Marley's posthumously released song Iron Lion Zion may refer to Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie's position. Emperor Haile Selassie I in Jamaica on an official state visit in 1966. Emperor Haile Selassie I in Jamaica on an official state visit in 1966. Selassie visited Canada in 1967 for an official state visit. CBC News interviewed the emperor and asked him a variety of questions including his position on Rastafarianism. Duration, 43 minutes and 14 seconds. 43:14. Audio-only version. Problems playing these files? See Media Help. In a 1967 recorded interview with the CBC, Haile Selassie denied his alleged divinity. In the interview, Bill McNeil says, "There are millions of Christians throughout the world, Your Imperial Majesty, who regard you as the reincarnation of Jesus Christ." Haile Selassie replied in his native language, "I have heard of that idea. I also met certain Rastafarians. I told them clearly that I am a man, that I am mortal, and that I will be replaced by the oncoming generation, and that they should never make a mistake in assuming or pretending that a human being is emanated from a deity." For many Rastafari, the CBC interview is not interpreted as a denial of his divinity. According to Robert Earl Hood, Haile Selassie neither denied nor affirmed his divinity either way. In Reggae Roots, the story of Jamaican music, Kevin Chang and Wayne Chen note, "It's often said, though no definite date or source is ever cited, that Haile Selassie himself denied his divinity." Former Senator and Gleaner editor, Hector Winter, tells of asking him, during his visit to Jamaica in 1966, when he was going to tell Rastafarians he was not God. "Who am I to disturb their belief?" replied the emperor. After his return to Ethiopia, he dispatched Archbishop Abuna Yeshak Mondifro to the Caribbean, and according to Yeshak this was done to help draw Rastafari and other West Indians to the Ethiopian Church. However, some sources suggest that certain islanders and their leaders were resenting the services of their former colonial churches and vocalized their interest of establishing the Ethiopian Church in the Caribbean, to which the emperor obliged. In 1969, Michael Manley visited the emperor at his palace in Addis Ababa before his election as Prime Minister of Jamaica in 1972. Haile Selassie spoke about his visit to Jamaica in 1966 and told Manley that he was totally dumbfounded by the Rastafarians' beliefs but that he had to be respectful of them. In 1948, Haile Selassie donated 500 hectares of land at Shashamane, 250 kilometers, 160 miles, south of Addis Ababa, to the Ethiopian World Federation Incorporated for the use of people of African descent who supported Ethiopia during the war, particularly those from the West. Numerous Rastafari families settled there and still live as a community to this day. Haile Selassie granted Rastafarians land on traditional Oromo domain, hence today the Rastas are viewed by the locals as invaders. History and nature. Legacy. Public opinion and media depiction. Haile Selassie I, visiting a children's hospital in 1969. During the beginning of his reign, and primarily in the 1930s through 1940s when Fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia, media coverage of Haile Selassie was positive, describing him as a hero against fascist forces. He was seen as an African beacon of hope and a friend and a part of the Allies in World War II. He was even featured as a Time Man of the Year in 1935 amidst the invasion. British Path reported that Haile Selassie's return was as an emperor returns and triumphs to his people. History and Nature. During one of his rare interviews with Meet the Press, in a 1963 state visit during the period of the civil rights movement in the U.S., he rebuked the notation of skin or race-based oppression of peoples and pushed a Pan-African narrative. Later NBC News was seen ridiculing the state visit months later. The New York Times provided counterpoints saying, "What civilized purpose is served by making a point of the fact months later to the probable embarrassment of the Ethiopian diplomatic representatives in this country?" It also said NBC News cannot afford to be a handmaiden of the State Department. During the 1950s, when the silver jubilee of the emperor's reign was celebrated, History and Nature. He adopted the 1955 Constitution, which legally gave more democratic rights to the public, and legally restricted the monarch's power. Since World War II ended, it played a major role towards the new administration. He limited and weakened the Orthodox Church's power. He was widely viewed as a modern and good leader in Ethiopia during the 1950s. Nonetheless, subsequently, in the 1970s, due to economic turmoil and a famine, Selassie's reputation suffered. Mass protests involving intellectuals and the common people occurred. It was widely believed that due to his old age and failed land reform policy implementation he should abdicate, which ultimately led to Selassie's removal from power. History and Nature. Defender of the Faith. Haile Selassie I. Portrait by Alvin Gittins, 1970. During the latter part of a 44-year reign. Emperor. Resting place Addis Ababa. Venerated in Oriental Orthodoxy, Armenian Apostolic Church, Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, Coptic Orthodox Church, Indian Orthodox Church, Syriac Orthodox Church. Although Haile Selassie's image and legacy has differed views, he is notably thought of as a modernizer, as one of the leading persons founding Haile Selassie University, and the Organization of African Unity, which later turned into the Africa Union, and an anti-colonial movement leader. He also has been listed by Time magazine among one of the most important figures in political history, even adding him in the top 25 political icons of all time. History and Nature. A battle which took over a decade regarding his Patek Philippe watch, which was initially on a Christie's auction for over $1 million, took place. Nonetheless, after the feud ended, the watch was pulled out of auction. In 2021, a false headline had circulated of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip bowing down to Haile Selassie and his wife during the Queen's state visit to Ethiopia at Jubilee Palace. In 2021, a documentary by Selassie's granddaughter was released showcasing the life of the Ethiopian royal family. The documentary, titled Grandpa Was an Emperor, has a 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes. In 2024, a movie dedicated to Bob Marley, One Love, 339, depicted Selassie in Rastafarian religious lore. There is a part where Selassie, whilst riding a horse, takes alongside him a young Marley. Haile Selassie has been depicted by photographers, portraits, and sculptors such as Edward Connell, Beulah Woodard, Jacob Epstein, William H. Johnson, Yvonne Middleton, and Alvin Gittins. History and Nature. Memorials. In recent years, multiple memorials were built and unveiled for Selassie, mainly in Ethiopia and one in Jamaica. One of these memorials is in the African Union's headquarters in Addis Ababa, unveiled in 2019. The other memorial in Addis Ababa is that of a wax statue in Unity Park. Selassie's memorial in the African Union was due to his long efforts of Pan-Africanism and anti-colonial efforts during his rule. Nonetheless, the statue caused some concern between groups, which howbeit was ultimately ignored and futile in effort. Another memorial, although not a statue, is a marker for a Kingston High School, not only a memorial but the school being named Haile Selassie High School. Other memorials exist, although being very old, such as in Addis Ababa, where the emperor is seen teaching 12 children roundabout. In 2020, a bust statue which was built in 1957 was destroyed by protesters allegedly claiming Haile Selassie's rule and legacy played a part with Ethiopian singer Haile Hundesa's assassination. Selassie also has a road, being one of the three major expressways in Nairobi being named after him. History and Nature. Haile Selassie I's statue located at the O Conference HQ, Addis Ababa. Wax figurine statue of the Emperor in Unity Park, Addis Ababa. Former standing statue of the Emperor in Wimbledon, England. A plaster figure of Selassie by Jacob Epstein in 1936, the New Art Gallery, Walsall, England. History and Nature. Titles, Styles, Arms, Honors. Styles of Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. Reference style. His Imperial Majesty. Amharic, Girmai. Spoken style. Your Imperial Majesty. Amharic, Janhoy. Lit. O esteemed royal. Alternative style. Our Lord, familiar. Amharic, Getaku. Lit. Our Master, PL. History and Nature. Main article, List of titles and honors of Haile Selassie. July 23, 1892 to November 1, 1905, Tafari Makonnen. November 1, 1905 to February 11, 1917, Djazmach Tafari Makonnen. February 11, 1917 to October 7, 1928, Lelras Tafari Makonnen. October 7, 1928 to November 2, 1930, Negus Tafari Makonnen. November 2, 1930 to September 12, 1974, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Elect of God. History and Nature. National Orders. Chief Commander of the Order of the Star of Ethiopia, 1909. Grand Collar of the Order of Solomon, 1930. Grand Cordon of the Order of the Seal of Solomon. Grand Cordon with Collar of the Order of the Queen of Sheba. Grand Cordon of the Order of the Holy Trinity. Grand Cordon of the Order of Menelik II. Order of Fidelity. History and Nature. Foreign Coat of Arms. Coat of Arms in Spain under the Order of Charles III of Spain. History and Nature. Coat of Arms as Emperor in the United Kingdom under the Order of Garter. Coat of Arms as Emperor under the Swedish Order of the Seraphim. History and Nature. As Sovereign. Imperial Royal Standard for Haile Selassie I. Reverse. Military ranks. Haile Selassie held the following ranks. History and Nature. Field Marshal, Imperial Ethiopian Army. Admiral of the Fleet, Imperial Ethiopian Navy. Marshal of the Imperial Ethiopian Air Force. Honorary Field Marshal, British Army, January 20, 1965. History and Nature. Issue. Name, Birth, Death Notes. Princess Romaine Work 1909 October 14, 1940 Married Djazmach Bayanimrid in the late 1920s, had 4 children. Djazmach Bayanimrid died in 1937. Princess Tenagna Work January 12, 1912 April 6, 2003 Married from 1924 to 1937, death, to Ras Desta Damtu, had 6 children. Remarried to Andargasha Mesai, who died in 1981, had 2 children. Crown Prince Haile Selassie July 27, 1916 January 17, 1997 Married Wolet Israel Seum in 1931, had 1 daughter. Amha and Wolet later divorced. Married Medfariash Work Abeba in 1945, had 4 children. Princess Zandwork July 25, 1917 March 24, 1934 Married Djazmach Haile Selassie Gugsa, no issue. History and Nature. Princess Sahai October 13, 1919 August 17, 1942 Married Liyabi Abeba in 1941, had a stillborn daughter. Prince Makonnen, Duke of Harar October 16, 1924 May 13, 1957 Married Sarah Giza, had 5 children. Prince Haile Selassie February 27, 1932 April 24, 1962 married Princess Mahi Sentehab Mariam, had one son. Please like, share, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can be the first to be notified whenever we post. You won't regret it.